All right, we are back, and it is going to be a marathon session with Douglas Dietrich. You know, we're not constrained by the live airtime, so this could be a while. We're planning on going for a couple more hours, and so we'll see how it goes. And really, there's no limit if Douglas doesn't become parched about his oration. And I'm okay here, and you're okay there. We do have some people listening on the, I guess you want to call it closed circuit. I don't know how you say it. The little thing I have from the webpage where people can listen to this live. Some people do like the live show. It is not the live time, so a lot of people aren't here who would be if it was at night, but unfortunately I just can't work it out that way. I did get a email. Let's see where I have it here. A comment from Jeffrey, who said, you gentlemen have done multiple shows, all of which were quite riveting. Thank you, sir. So that's Jeffrey's comment. And welcome back, Douglas.
Yes, thanks so much. I'm glad to be here. And we're getting now into essentially the covert space program and what its impact is on human history. So do you have anything you want to say before I launch into the tirade on that? I was essentially going to, start off with...
No, just go ahead, because I like going for the ride, because it's not like you have kind of a way of taking us on a journey, and I don't like to disrupt that a lot of times. But if I got something, I'll pop in.
No, great. Well, the dawn of the modern space-age race started in March of 1926 with Dr. Robert Goddard, an American. He launched the first liquid-fueled rocket. And in June of 1929, Friedrich Stammer in Germany made the first manned rocket flight. It was a rocket-powered flight in what was known as a Raketenfahrt glider, designed by Dr. Alexander Lippisch. And Fahrt means travel in most European languages, including German. And in America and England, it means something else entirely. But in any rate, July of 1929, there was a launch failure of Dr. Goddard's first instrumental rocket, and it caused neighbors to obtain an injunction preventing further launches in Massachusetts. He lived in Boston. And as a result, his development was ridiculed in the press. He became increasingly reclusive. So what he did was, in November of 1929, he was able to gain a Guggenheim grant with help from Charles Lindbergh. And Charles Augustus Lindbergh was, of course, a famous Nazi sympathizer and a person who ultimately was decisive in getting the uranium little boy bomb and examples of such standardized Axis atomic ordnance at the time of Roosevelt's death in the Truman administration, and it was Lindbergh's attainment of this little boy bomb that allowed the Americans a bomb to drop on Hiroshima at all. So Charles Lindbergh was to play a decisive goodwill ambassador role between the Third Reich and the United States. He ultimately left the United States for the Third Reich in exile, moving himself and his family to Argentina. And how anyone doesn't know about this in the United States is beyond me. But then again, this is all part of that democratic propaganda system where you are given no information whatsoever. What it provides is a democracy of ignorance.
Well, now, we can talk about like Batman and Robin and stuff like that. I'd probably
Now, where did Goddard go to with this Guggenheim grant? He went to the most isolated area in the United States where no one would bother him or make fun of him anymore. He went to Roswell, New Mexico. And that's where he proceeded to test his rockets and where people were to find alien debris for the next 50 years as the basis of his penetration of the atmosphere with American rockets that he had developed. So this is, again, part of the crap that we're dealing with in terms of America and its educational system, its fractured, warped, fantastic reality, literally fantastic reality, that it's stitched together like a Frankensteinian monstrosity out of anything that really happened. Now, this is just beginning aspects of the space program. There are other things that were going on that impacted America in terms of its compartmentalization. One of them was the establishment of DARPA, which existed in World War II. not in the 1950s or 60s or 70s. All they did was take the World War II organization, which went black, meaning it went off the books, and it became public again. In other words, a secret organization was outed because it had been so secret that it doesn't make it into World War II history textbooks. Well, what are DARPA's origins? Basically, they originated on June 20th of 1937 when a Soviet Ant-25, ANT-25, successfully made a transpolar flight from Moscow to Vancouver. And this was done by the hero of the Soviet Union, Valery Chkalov. And his last name is spelled Chkalov. Valery Chkalov basically conducted the Sputnik flight of his day. By doing so, unannounced and without warning, a Soviet aircraft piloted by him flew into United States territory. Now, over Alaskan airspace, which was not a state of the United States, but a territory. So when he violated American territorial sovereignty, then the Americans responded with the creation of the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, NACA, N-A-C-A, obviously the precursor to NASA, another paramilitary agency. Well, Dr. Vannevar Bush, the Dean of Engineering at MIT, began to coordinate all of this and Goddard's work through DARPA. Now, he was later to totally alienate Dr. Robert Goddard because he took a young man by the name of Jack Whiteside Parsons, who was an avowed and practicing Satanist. And this chemist at Caltech, along with Theodore von Karman, had developed solid fuel rocket boosters. So they kicked Goddard out and they put Parsons in. Later on, when the Japanese balloon bombs were setting fires all over the United States, and this was so well hidden from the U.S. by the OWI, the Office of War Information, which we had earlier referenced, they approached Dr. Goddard and said, "What do we do about the Japanese bombing? We can't stop it." And he said, "Are you insane? My rockets cost hundreds of dollars, the equivalent of thousands of today's dollars, to build out of metal, components, fuel. And you're asking me to take down Japanese balloon bombs that they're putting together with silk and rice paper and literally using candy as glue. It's pennies on the dollar. We can't win this." And they said, "What can we do?" And he said, "Build an American kamikaze." And one was ultimately designed, which most Americans have never heard of. So this is the kind of hidden history that we're talking about. As a matter of fact, to my eternal shame and disgrace, I don't remember the name of the test pilot offhand. I'll have to go through my notes. So we'll do that during the next break if people are interested, if we get any requests for that. Other than that, accept my word for it. There were American kamikazes that were made. American test pilots died testing out their function because they knew this would ultimately be needed to attack the Japanese aero dreadnoughts, which ultimately helped to win the war for Japan, not the United States. So this is the kind of front that we're dealing with. We're still dealing with a Pacific-oriented front. Now, on terms of the Reich and what they were dealing with, Dr. Paul Joseph Goebbels helped to win the war with a fake UFO wave. Basically, people don't understand how different the Reich was. It was polyocracy. We had Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering in control of the Luftwaffe, and because he didn't want dependence on other armed services such as the Army or the SS, he basically made sure that the Luftwaffe not only controlled all anti-aircraft gunnery, but it also controlled its own branch of paratroopers. It also controlled its own armored division, the Hermann Goering Division. It also controlled 27 infantry divisions. These were all Luftwaffe, Air Force, not Army. So he was able to call on whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Now the SS had its own Air Force, had its own paratroopers. Their Air Force was known as the Luftstarre. These were Hitler Youth that were recruited into the SS to attack American bombers in rocket planes, vertical takeoff and landing. The Americans know nothing about this. They could take off, they couldn't land, so the Hitler Youth used to direct the rockets up towards the bombers and then parachute out and allow the rocket to continue on towards the bomber. Americans know nothing of the Luftstarre, but the SS had its own Air Force. So this is the kind of different interdepartmental empires that we're speaking of. Dr. Paul Joseph Goebbels controlled what the Americans called the Kraut balls. In the Pacific, they were called Foo Fighters. The Germans called them Feuer balls, F-E-U-R balls, fireballs. These were radio remote controlled, multiple-headed magnesium flares. Imagine a nautical mine flying through the sky. And they had super elongated coils to provide extended duration. And now, because the Third Reich was the first state to exploit television as a state medium, Joseph Goebbels was able to convince the Allied governors or high command that their signals were the first to be intercepted by alien intelligence. We have to remember that in the sphere of radio waves, which started exploding from the planet Earth, when Marconi first sent that little letter S out into the radio aether, since that period of time, that little S has been at the forefront of an ever-expanding sphere of radio waves radiating from the Earth that by 1945 covered hundreds of stars, because radio waves travel at the speed of light. So even with the amount of radio dispersion out there and the Third Reich's dispersion of television waves, we have to remember that when the Americans were confronted with propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels' statement, they actually also had, working against them, people who already believed in aliens. One of the best examples of this was a man, if I remember correctly, his name was Air Chief Marshal Sir Victor Goddard, very coincidentally. And he was a British member of the High Command, and he was the man who organized the Massey Project, which was Britain's version of Project Blue Book. And he was an outspoken believer in alien craft. He ultimately came out of the closet with this in the 1950s and admitted to that, but didn't admit to...
No, we lost the signal. May have to call Douglas back. All right, we're back in recording.
Yeah, I was talking about Reich's propaganda minister, Dr. Paul Joseph Goebbels, had convinced the Allied High Command that since extraterrestrials in near space to terrestrial orbit had intercepted television signals from the Third Reich, they knew there was human life on planet Earth, and what they had concluded, as extraterrestrials are wont to do per the Goebbels paradigm, that there could only be one recognized government over the planet Earth. And since they first got signals from the Third Reich was that government. So the extraterrestrials would only deal with the Third Reich government as the legitimate government for all of planet Earth.
Now, what put it in their head that there was extraterrestrials? I mean, without going into another giant rabbit hole, and where did that idea even come from?
Well, obviously, science fiction books had been written for quite some time, novels, pulp magazines, and the reality was that, for instance, atomic bombs were tossed about, destroying entire cities, making them glow in the dark. This is literally how it was described in science fiction novels ever since Einstein came up with the theory of E equals mc squared. Because once Einstein came up with that theory, any trained physicist the world over, Japanese, American, British, they all knew that would lead to a tremendous release in energy. So science fiction novelists took that and they used literary conceit and created the atomic bomb and deployed it on a massive level 20 years before the atomic age was recognized by the rest of the world as a literal reality. So the same with aliens. So the idea was really in American and British heads from Pulp Fiction. Now, the Soviets had their equivalent later, but they were too busy struggling for survival at the beginning stages of the Soviet Empire to really participate much in this kind of indulgence. So Reich's propaganda minister targeted, Joseph Goebbels targeted his audience. He targeted the West. And because he convinced the West of this, it was the West that stood back while the Nazi high command pretty much exfiltrated out of Germany to create a government in exile. This is how you had people like three German scientists working for Generalissimo Francisco Franco in secret laboratories near Marbella in the south coast of Spain, basically east of Gibraltar. During that period of time, in the summer of 1946, when the Americans said, hey, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini set up Francisco Franco. He's a fascist dictatorship. We got to take him out. We've got to invade Spain. So he was sitting on basically his yacht east of Gibraltar, and he had Koch and Mueller, I'm thinking of the machine gun, Heckler and Koch. I mean Knoll and Mueller, Knoh and Mueller. Both of these were known as the H&K of the skies, or the Heckler and Koch of the skies. They were responsible for designing the KM-2. This was an electromagnetic rocket, and basically it was designated after its inventors, Professors Knoll and Mueller. That's hence the KM-2. And it had a range of 16,000 kilometers. And once its control is disengaged, it's attracted to the electric vibrations of passing aircraft, or the magnetism of the nearest metal mass. It explodes on impact with an attracting source. And because of that, when the Americans threatened to invade Spain and take out Franco, he had these scientists launch these rockets, and basically they were aimed at North America, launched at the heights of Malaga while General Franco was watching from the deck of his yacht. And they took down 2 commercial airliners over the American continent in the summer of 1946. And so he basically took down 2 planes full of American passengers. And he said, you take me out, and I'll wipe your air fleet out of the skies. And that's how Francisco Franco stayed in power after the fall of the Third Reich and Italy, without any interference for the rest of his life. And if you think that's wild, then think about Factory 333, half of 666. So Factory 333 was at Heliopolis, outside Cairo. It was directed by Eugen Sanger, S-A-N-G-R. Himself the godfather of the boost glide rocket technology that founded the Dyna-Soar. Dyna is D-Y-N-A, like dynamic, dash soar, S-O-A-R, like soaring above the clouds. Dyna-Soar was the American military space shuttle. People can look this up. It was designed and fielded by the United States military. That was originally designed by Eugen Sanger. So what's the military history of that? Basically, what had happened was that during the Second World War, the Germans used that to bomb Soviet factories behind the Urals Mountains. U-R-A-L-S. A lot of people know about the Urals Mountains. A lot of people know that Stalin moved all of the industry behind the Urals Mountains out of the range of German invasion when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. So a lot of people don't know that the Germans bombed those factories using these boost gliders. So that means that the first space shuttles were deployed by the Third Reich. That means the first men into space were Nazi Raumänner, spacemen, their version of cosmonauts or astronauts. In May of 1942, in conjunction with the launch of Case Blue Summer Offensive, the Germans began bombing using Sanger's boost glide rockets. And these basically struck at Soviet trans-Ural industrial bases with poor accuracy. But nevertheless, over time, the attacks took their toll. The bomber's design was an antipodal skip bomber. It skipped off the atmosphere like a stone skipping over a lake. And ironically, their design forced them to skip all the way around the world after each attack run, soaring high over China and Central America while taking the long way back to Germany. And this made the Germans explore the space environment just as they had explored the atmosphere at the time of using high atmospheric altitudinal bombing over London with Zeppelins or airships. So just as they were able to conquer all of the problems of physiology with Zeppelin technology, they had to contend with all aspects of space technology by being the first people to bomb the Eurasian continent from space. Half of Earth's atmosphere is located just 3 miles above sea level. And in the bottom of the troposphere, most humans need supplemental oxygen to sustain efficient performance before they reach that elevation. That's mountain climbers. By the time we get to the level of where the Zeppelins and the Japanese aero dreadnoughts were at, pressurized suits or cabins were preferable, and they became obligatory at about 9 miles because crew members are unable to expel carbon dioxide and water vapor from their lungs unassisted. Otherwise, they suffocate. Now, military aircraft and space vehicles depend on pure air produced in a sealed environment after they approach altitudes that approximate 15 miles, where heat transfer gets excessive, poisonous ozone is present, and turbojet engines refuse to function much above 20 miles. Ramjets sputter and stop down. Altimeters, as soon as the altimeters hit 28 miles. And at that point, rockets are required. And that's exactly what Eugen Sanger had developed. Now, the Americans didn't get any of this. They all went to the Soviets after the end of the war. What people don't understand is that Werner von Braun came to the United States. His brother Hermann went to the Soviet Union. Both of them were in the status of observers for the Third Reich's government in exile. And they were essentially celebrity diplomats. Why no one understands this within either respective culture of the Soviet Union or the United States, again, is beyond me. But at any rate, these men were describing to the Americans what the dinosaur would ultimately become, and that's how it was developed based on what Werner von Braun shared with the Americans as a technical exchange advisor with a government in exile that the Americans maintained diplomatic relations with because they were convinced by Reich's propaganda minister, Dr. Paul Joseph Goebbels, that if this government, the Third Reich, was not recognized and maintained in continuity, that the aliens would not contend with them because the aliens recognized the Third Reich as the legitimate government of planet Earth. Do you realize the complexity of what I'm saying?
As I said, it is a journey.
But does it make sense? I hope it's coherent,
yeah.
At least. Now, again, in terms of how does that bring us back to Factory 333, Heliopolis, outside Cairo, directed by Eugen Sanger, the man himself. Because Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of Egypt, was a pan-Islamist, he was a pan-Africanist, he was a pan-Arabist. He was essentially the mantle for three super ideological movements that made him the most dangerous man on earth. Worse yet, he nationalized the Suez Canal. And the Americans were going to take him out. Now, what they came into was the fact that he confronted them with basically what was ultimately written about very briefly in the Washington Post article in the 1950s where they spoke about Factory 333, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and the New Africa Corps. Now, the New Africa Corps consisted of no less than about 400 Nazi scientists. Now, what he told the Americans about this Missile Project Center, directly lifted from Peenemünde and relocated into Egypt, was that he had radioactive warheads, and he was going to use them to continue the war against what he was convinced were Jewish people who controlled the Soviet Union and the United States. This was a parallel Egyptian aerospatial program of space bombers and missiles, which, again, doesn't make it into your history books. It was run by a virulent anti-Semite who was convinced that a Zionist conspiracy manipulated the American and Soviet alliance. Now, when he nationalized the Suez Canal, America experienced a crisis far worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. At that point, Britain, France, and Israel united to attack Egypt, to retake the canal. And the Americans almost went to war with France, Britain, and Israel under Eisenhower, whose granddaughter will be at the UFO Con 2012. Look that up at ufocon2012.com. Now, think about what I'm saying. The Americans almost went to war with France, Britain, and Israel under Eisenhower because Gamal Abdel Nasser told Eisenhower, if you think General Francisco Franco took down 2 airliners with his 3 scientists, you think of what I can do with almost 1,000 Nazi scientists. And I'm going to wipe your civilian air fleet out of the skies if you come touch me. And again, he's a ruler who lived in charge of his nation till the day he died. And the British, the French, and the Israelis withdrew in defeat. And you never hear about this in your history books. Just another example of covert space programs which are just wildly divergent from the fantasy in which Americans live. And in terms of that crisis, to show you how different it was, you can look up Eisenhower's quotes at the time. Eisenhower was brought to the point because Gamal Abdel Nasser was at war with Israel. And Eisenhower was going to go to war with Israel, Britain, and France. Eisenhower is quoted. People can look this up. Probably the most accessible resource on this would be books written by journalists who were there at the time. These were journalists. So these quotes were published in papers at the time. But probably the best book that compiles a number of these quotes would be Warriors at Suez. I can't remember the author. One of the few sources publicly available on this. But Eisenhower is quoted as saying, "We have to convince the Jews in the United States to think like Americans instead of Jews. They have to identify with the United States instead of Israel." I mean, can you imagine an American politician even dreaming of saying something like this in this day and age? This is the kind of crises that Eisenhower was facing. The Cuban Missile Crisis looked like nothing compared to this. And they've managed to take this out of your history books completely. Well, in terms of what the Nazis developed with their technology, people are going to be saying, well, what about, anti-gravitics or all this good stuff that they're constantly hearing about? And the Nazis did develop the equivalent of that thanks to Asian Indian, a physicist, a mathematical physicist by the name of Subramanian Chandrasekhar. And his last name was spelled Chandrasekhar. Chandrasekhar. Now, he was around 1935, he came up with a calculation that proved, as far as any theoretical prediction can prove, that stars of a mass of above 1.4 times that of our sun will at the end of their lives collapse infinitely. Now, this was the first statement of the existence of black holes. Now, he presented this to the Royal Astronomical Society of Britain because India was ruled by the British Raj. Now, the man who ran the Royal Astronomical Society was a jackass by the name of Arthur Eddington. And Sir Arthur Eddington behaved abominably, and basically it was at the point where the British scientists looked upon Subramanian Chandrasekhar as a yellow nigger. And that term was actually bandied about. And he was so persecuted, he ultimately had to leave the British Empire and move to the United States, where he volunteered to help the Americans develop an atomic bomb. And you know what the Americans said? They said they couldn't give him a security clearance because of his ethnicity.
Oh, jeez.
And so, who did use the Chandrasekhar equations? The Nazis and the Japanese. Because as an Asian Indian, all of the Japanese and the Germans believed the people of Iran and northern India to be Aryan. And the very term Iran is simply the Greek word for Aryan. The Shah of Iran was known as the protector of all Aryans. That was his formal title. The Shah of Iran married a German woman. Now, because of this ethnic connection, the Japanese believed that the Japanese race was an Aryan race descended from Asian India through maritime migrations, whereas the Germans believed they were descended from the Aryans of northern India and Persia through overland route migrations into Europe. So they said, this is Aryan science. And they fed it into the computers created by Konrad Zuse, Z-U-S-E. And Konrad Zuse was the man, German, who created the world's first modern computer. And this was basically developed, again, 1935, the same year that Chandrasekhar came up with the equations for black holes. Now, they fed all of these computations in Konrad Zus's machine and came to the logical physics conclusion that these black holes not only existed, but that at the very center of our galaxy was a supermassive black hole, which all of the other stars in the galaxy revolve around. As a matter of fact, this is what creates galaxies. Every galaxy has at its center a cluster of stars that are there because of a supermassive black hole. This became known as the Schwarzen Sun, the Black Sun. This is where the term the Reich of the Black Sun comes from. The Empire of the Black Sun of the Japanese comes from. This is where covert projects, black budget projects, such as Black Sun projects under Japan came from. Biological weapons, atomic and chemical weapons development. In Germany, it was the Nazi Fischer-Tropsch equations, which created synthetic gas, synthetic fuels. It was the Nazi anti-gravity equations for the Nazi Bell, which is a experiment platform for anti-gravitics that had a classification level higher than that of atomic weapons in the Third Reich. So we're talking about this incredible experimentation that was made possible only through their use of Chandrasekhar's mathematics and Nazi Konrad Zuse computer systems. So they attained a 50-year leap, a half-century leap in technology because the Nazis and the Japanese were less racist than the Americans and the British. Now, can you imagine the implications of what I'm saying? I mean, this is essentially what we're dealing with in terms of from Goebbels' greatest victory on convincing the Allies that the aliens were on the side of the Axis to the point where they're developing the Fischer-Tropsch equations. Fischer is spelled F-I-S-C-H-E-R. Tropsch is, after a hyphen, is T-R-O-P-P. And this enabled them to convert coal into synthetic oil. Again, think about what I'm saying. And then what happened was they ultimately used this to apply Einstein's development of torsion tensor systems. Now, keep in mind, to the Germans, all that propaganda you hear about, oh, Adolf Hitler wouldn't develop the atomic bomb because Einstein was Jew, and that was Jewish science. It's all crap spread by the Office of War Information, which carries it on to this day. The reality was the Germans thought Einstein was an excellent example of what you can produce with German education. And they took his equations and they basically applied his torsion tensor, which he himself was basically developing at one point in his career, combined it with the Hungarian electrical system engineers. His name was Gabriel Kron, K-H-R-O-N. He was experimenting with anomalous energy. And basically, he was in one of the universities of Belgium. And he, in 1935, again, same time as Chandrasekhar came up with these equations, same time as Konrad Zuse introduced the first modern computer system, he basically came up with a unified field of gravity and physics concerning spherical and toroidal electromagnetism. Now, before we get into all of these abstract physical equations, we don't really need to get into them because, remember, I'm approaching this as a documents destruction specialist, not as an engineer or as a physicist. What I can tell you is that 4 decades ahead of everyone save the Philadelphia experiment, the Nazi Bell, and other experiments conducted in the Third Reich led to the development of a super physics well ahead of what the Americans had developed. And through this, the Nazis were able to go beyond rocketry, and the Third Reich in exile was operating with, shall we say, a higher level of technology in a breakaway civilization, while the Americans were still operating with rockets. This is why the German technicians that were in the Soviet Union and the United States were looking on the Soviet Union and the United States as primitive societies. And now the war still went on. And this is why the United States was given orders in terms of the Air Force to shoot down any flying saucers. And in the end, while the United States was warring with the communist bloc, they were simultaneously warring with this ufological presence. Now, 166 crewmen died, tickling the Russians and the Chinese with reconnaissance overflights, U-2 planes. Now, between 1951 and 1956, 204 major reported destroyed and missing fighter aircraft incidents took place fighting the Nazis. 229 planes were destroyed and 192 vanished. This was published in the New York Times. And so we're talking about a period of time known as the Disc War, in which the Third Reich was able to kill hundreds of airmen. And the Americans ultimately responded at the source, because in the 1950s, according to all the documents I destroyed, and ultimately you have people who, like Len Stringfield, who worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, who admitted publicly that the aerospace war that was being conducted at the time between the Third Reich government and Exile in the United States, 2,000 American pilots died between the late 1940s and 1950s in this disc war. And where was it all sourcing? It was all sourcing out of Antarctica, where the Third Reich government in exile had established its Area 51 without the tourists. And if you think what I said about that Japanese island, which is basically part of Tokyo, that means that it's essentially occupied by the Tokyo Police Department, is unable to suffer American invasion. You can imagine what it was like in Antarctica. I mean, basically, the computers that were originally built were very large. They generated a lot of heat. They would have made eminently destructible targets for American bombing. So all that interdepartmental empire system, the polyocracy of the Third Reich that I was speaking to, obviously begs the question of who ran the computers. Heinrich Himmler ran the SS, the Schutzstaffel. Reichspropaganda Minister Dr. Paul Joseph Goebbels ran the Ministry of Propaganda and Enlightenment, which convinced the Americans that there were aliens. Goering ran the Luftwaffe. Who ran the computers? Obviously, Albert Speer was in charge of war production. Well, Martin Bormann ran the computers. And he told Adolf Hitler the best place to put them, where the Americans can't hit us, will be in Antarctica. So basically...
So there were documents that you saw confirmed the legend that there was a Nazi presence in Antarctica.
Absolutely. Well, that's something no one can argue with, because that was a major media event when the Nazis started exploring Antarctica.
Well, I mean, as in a base. I mean, because I know there's like they actually, are still there for that matter. I mean, they have these legends that there was a significant, they brought war machines there, they built caves and buildings and whatnot. In fact, I read some kind of a book by Clive Cussler, and it's one of it's a novel, but it went into this whole thing that they were actually still there, and working.
Well, the reality is they were there, and then they ultimately resettled and relocated elsewhere because Antarctica had its problems. Antarctica, of course, is still very isolated. It is effectively off limits. Certainly, it wasn't until the 1990s that they began to conduct some environmental tourism under heavy supervision and observation. You have minders like North Korea when you go around in Antarctica. You are required by international law, and this is enforced when you're down there, to wear international orange, and that is all you will ever wear when you're down there. I mean, so it's not like you're taking any normal vacation in the hometown sense of the word. So we're talking about an extremely isolated area, and what had happened was, yes, the Germans had established themselves there, and the history of that is well accessible. We're talking about in probably around 1937 was when the MS Schwabenland, which was an old mail ship and plane carrier, was outfitted at the cost of about 1 million Reichsmarks and rechristened the New Schwabenland. And its purpose was to survey as much of the Antarctic coast and interior as it could. Left Hamburg on December 17th of 1938, arrived in January 19th of 39, and so all of the discoveries of geothermal energy, similar to what could be exploited in Iceland, was made at that time. And in the end, the Germans resettled a huge base there that became an entry point or a gateway for a reestablishment of the Third Reich in government in exile, but that was conducted elsewhere. As for we're talking about the 1950s by the time, or 40s by the time that the Germans have moved, late 40s, early 50s, into underground caverns that were not directly underneath Antarctica, but many, many miles away, and underneath the seabed floor. But there were many, many caverns of such size. I've gone into this before as to how these caverns exist.
I mean, the reason why I bring this up is that it seems to me that in current day that there's an awful lot of attention being paid down in Antarctica and no attention being paid in the North Pole. Right. It just seems like, I know there's ground down there where there's water in the North Pole, but it just seems like, well, what's special about the dirt that's under the ice there as opposed to the water that's under the ice on the north? And it just seems like there's something out there. I mean, whether it be remnants of a German constructions or an ancient Atlantean city or whatever it be.
Well, certainly all of this has validity, but the endpoint is that to concentrate on Antarctica specifically, as opposed to the giant caverns known as Unterland, or the land below, which is the name that the Germans gave it. Basically, keep in mind that they were working with this in the 1930s, not only in Antarctica, but also in Tibet. People hear about these things constantly in popular media about the Nazi expedition to Tibet, etc., and they talk about this, and they what they never allude to is exactly what that has to do with today's world and how exactly it impacts us today. Well, it still continues to impact us today because that's where the Third Reich government in exile exists. Now, I was born in a government in exile. I was born in the Nationalist Republic of China as reestablished on the island of Taiwan. So I know exactly how governments in exile function. And the end result was that the Third Reich became an not recognized by the United Nations is what I'm referring to, an unrecognized government in exile, just like my government did. And my government has an enormous impact on the world. Basically, if Taiwan were to be taken out, your entire information highway would die. All of the computer hardware in the world effectively is manufactured in Taiwan. Taiwan, at many points in recent history, was the 8th largest economy in the world. And you're talking about basically about 25 million people whose economy until the 1990s was 20 times larger than that of the Chinese mainland, where 1 billion people live. So you're talking about an economy that's enormous, and yet you've never heard of it. It's not recognized by the United Nations. This is how screwed up your world is, and why Americans live in a fantasy land. By the way, I remember now the name of that American kamikaze. The name of it was the Northrop XP-79B, developed in 1945, and it ultimately was something that was intended by the Americans as a suicide aircraft to kill Japanese super dirigibles. The pilot who tested it out as a suicide pilot was Harry Crosby, C-R-O-S-B-Y. Harry Crosby died in a suicide attack to prove that the American kamikaze would work. This was what ultimately was recommended by Dr. Robert Goddard. And the day that Dr. Robert Goddard, since he had resettled in Boston, Massachusetts, when they gave his job to the Satanist, Jack Parsons, the day of the Hiroshima the Nagasaki bombing, by the time of August 9th, when the Americans bombed Hiroshima on August 6th, the Japanese launched the super dirigibles, 3 of them. They had over a dozen more waiting in reserve in mainland China. They launched 3 of them to the United States, loaded with, amongst other toxins, botulinum toxin, which is so concentrated a toxin that 1 pound of it, if properly distributed, could kill 1 billion people.
Now, if I can go back up to this pilot, was that pilot Harry Crosby, the guy who?
Yes, that's correct.
Because I'm reading about how he had claimed that it was a malfunction in the aircraft, and he tried to bail out, and it got hit by the aircraft and was killed. So they're putting it down as a malfunction, and the project ended. When they built one, it malfunctioned and ended.
He proved that it served its function. What do they say it's for? It's an American kamikaze. So if
obviously they're not saying that. I'm just saying that. I'm just trying to connect the dots here. Obviously, I'm not saying that this stuff is correct. I'm fascinated to see how things are spun, is what I should say.
Oh, yeah. I mean, keep in mind, I looked up the German Chancellor, Helmut Kohl, was the longest-serving German Chancellor, the longest-serving leader in German history. And Helmut Kohl, I looked up on Wikipedia, and they had it that he was still alive, and the poor guy died. A long time ago. That'll show you what Wikipedia is like. But do they show the Northrop XP-79B? Do they show any photos of it or anything? You might get an idea about its function.
Yeah, I see it. It does look like a kind of a one-way ticketer, as I would put it.
Yes.
They don't have is it the B? Yeah, they showed a. It does look kind of like it's going to bludgeon into something.
Yes, it's a ram ship.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was definitely intended as a ram craft. If you read the technical details,
it's actually a real short wheelbase. I mean, I think that would have been hard to land.
Yeah.
Which would kind of go along with that. I mean, I'm not a expert.
Well, an aerodynamics expert who did look at that would basically.
Oh wow, the guy lays in it, looking forward.
Yeah. Yes, prone. The pilot is prone.
Yeah.
And it basically, if you take a look at it, you'll notice that it's basically has a it's got a reinforced front because it's a ram craft. So you've got a plastic bubble, which is instead of a normal glass windshield, it's largely made out of magnesium, which used Northrop's patented heliarc welding process. And so you definitely got a incredibly strong ram craft. It's a rocket plane that's meant to crash into a superdirigible and blow it up. So you've got a radical design that is built in 1945. Now think about what I'm saying. So that shows you how desperate the Americans were.
According to this data on here, I'm looking at a different page. It can pretty much only carry 3,000 pounds, which doesn't sound like a whole lot of weaponry unless you're going to put one bomb in there, to ram into it.
Yes.
I would say that, looking at the design of it and what it could carry, that it's reasonable that this would be something to drive in with the intent of going a one-way ticket.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, it's unreasonable to do that. It's a reasonable for you to say, looking at it. I don't really particularly like the idea of kamikazes in any form, but no one's asking me for guidance in weaponry.
Right. Well, there you have it, and certainly that is something that people need to keep in mind. Now, in the case of Germany, one of the first things that happened was the response to the German reestablishment of even a base where they were moving high-tech weaponry to prevent it from being bombed into Antarctica. Was we have to remember this started about January through February of 1939. About the time of the, well before World War II re-erupted on the continent of Europe.
I just want, if I can interrupt 1 second, I just saw another reference to the XP-97 as the flying ram.
Yeah.
So that's another little thing. Okay, go ahead.
No, thank you. No, thank you. All the reinforcement is certainly approved, and basically, my point is that what we had was the battle started for the Antarctic. These were the battles of the South Atlantic as opposed to the North Atlantic around 1943 and 1945. Between that period of time, the British launched a secret wartime series of Antarctic operations codenamed Tabarin, Tabarin. Sometimes it's referred to as with an L, Tabalin, as opposed to Tabarin. And this is what they would often do, even in the United States. In the days before computers, you could keep people from sourcing or referencing something for years just by a misspelling or an alteration of spelling. So that's entirely intentional. But this was a covert, behind-the-lines, special forces series of operations where they deployed SAS commandos to try and take out that base. There was a failed occupation attempt at Hope Bay in the winter of 1944. And the British, to this day, will insist that these were geology and biology survey programs. In the middle of a war using SAS commandos. And they'll insist that they were there as civilians.
Well, I mean, even Wikipedia is saying, has to go along with it. It is a military thing.
Yeah, well, there you go. In January and February of 1942, Comandante Alberto Odera of Argentina aboard the Primero de Mayo defeated the British at Deception Island in the South Shetlands on February 24th. Specifically, there was a major battle which the Argentinians won at Melchior and Argentine Islands, and the British never forgave them for it. And then, of course, by the time of 1946, 1947, we had the American invasion. And so the Americans basically were working with what Americans have come to know, of course, as good God, what did they call it again? The invasion of Antarctica. I believe it was Operation Highjump.
Yeah, I got Highjump, windmill.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, there was a series of invasions and battles to eliminate the source of the disc aircraft sourcing from Antarctica. Now, Operation Highjump was officially titled the United States Navy's Antarctic Development Program, was in the southern summer of 1946 to 1947, and the United States Navy operation was organized, of course, supposedly by Rear Admiral Byrd. He was actually the scapegoat, and it was actually organized by many other people who were involved that were running the United States Navy. The Secretary of the Navy himself, James Forrestal, was along for the ride, physically there, and he was later thrown from a window in a mental ward at Bethesda Naval Hospital because of what he had seen concerning the Third Reich government in exile. Now, Admiral Nimitz actually commandeered the Seavor 47, which was part of that entire expeditionary force. Admiral Kreutzen took the North Wind, which was another part of that expeditionary force. We're talking about all of the major names in the Navy organized Task Force 68, as it was known. We're talking about well over 5,000 sailors. Now, my father volunteered for this. And they wouldn't let him go because he had a mouthful of metal teeth from years of drinking as a sailor. And down in Antarctica, your teeth contract because of the cold, and it becomes excruciatingly painful, and you can't function. So that's when your teeth are metal. So that's why Heinrich Himmler demanded that every man in the SS have perfect teeth, was because the Antarctic expeditions could not tolerate men who had metal teeth. So the USS aircraft carrier, the Philippine Sea, was the CV-47 that ultimately was commandeered by Admiral Nimitz when Admiral Byrd's expedition essentially began to fail. It had over 100 aircraft, and it wasn't assigned to any of the groups. It was functioning as the firebase fixer, the flagship, and the Essex-class carrier was about 900 feet long, had 3,500 men on it alone, and 6 ski-wheeled jet-assisted takeoff fitted R4D Skytrain transports. So we're talking about they were meant to be able to take off without a runway, being basically seaplanes. And so we had a submarine, the Senate. Basically, we had various icebreakers and ships, and about 4,700 troops from the U.S., Britain, and Australia. And they provided over 40 ships from the Australian and Canadian contingency forces. You never even see them referred to in the American Operation Highjump. You had a British and Norwegian contingency force, a Russian contingency force, and you had literally about 3,500 Marines who all died on the ice because they were massacred by the German discraft that wiped them off, known as Flugelads. And the Flugelads were essentially basically helicopters where the blades are around the body of the craft as opposed to over the craft. And they're not necessarily that fast moving. They're not necessarily that, they're more revolutionary in design than anything else. But when you mounted rockets on them, they were sufficiently deadly where they wiped out the landing force. And the end result was the Americans had to resort to nuclear tactics because the Germans were so advanced with their space program that through the Exile government in Antarctica, they were launching ships to the moon. And because of that, they were able to establish a base on the southern pole of the moon that would, of course, die without reinforcement. This was the battle for orbit that is so important for Americans to know about in an understanding of the frontier of space. And what exactly is that frontier all about? This new battlefield that we're talking about. We're talking about the Earth-Moon system. Basically, planet Earth is a binary planet that, combined with the moon, is really inseparable. It's the moon's tides that make life even possible on Earth. And so, basically, the entire Earth-Moon system has as its center mass something about 1,000 miles beneath Earth's surface. So that is the center mass for this binary planet system. Now, when you get into that military spacecraft kind of engineering that to contend with this system, then you basically realize that the Nazis were doing exactly what they were doing when they were bombing the Soviet Union. Any spacecraft launched due east gets a flying start from Earth's rotation, which makes it easier to attain orbital velocity benefits. And so the end result was, because of the enormous head start, then the Germans were able to make it to the moon before anyone else. And they were able to counteract gravity using this kind of antipodal skip effect. But what kind of environment do we have in space? What did the Germans have to contend with? They had to contend with basically all kinds of environmental factors that we'll get into. Space is totally black. Light can't scatter in very thin air or hard vacuums. Total silence prevails. There's no shock waves or sonic booms, regardless of vehicle velocities. Basically, you're talking about structures that are frigid on one side, are torrid on the other, so they undergo great stress. And you've got cosmic rays beyond the Van Allen radiation belts that pose additional problems. You've got sporadic solar flares that cause proton storms that project high energy, high charge, high density, long-range flux 1,000,000 times more powerful than particles in routine solar winds. You know, and less potent doses can damage or destroy human cells, including components of the central nervous system. So these already cause communications blackouts, and they discombobulate poorly protected guidance systems. So the Germans were contending with all of that. The average voyage from Earth to the moon averages about 240,000 miles of cislunar space. That's environmentally pretty much the same as circumterrestrial space above the Van Allen radiation belts. But more important than all of that are what are known as lunar libration points. And these are gravity wells. Basically, they're no points at all. They're three-dimensional positions in space that are shaped somewhat like kidney beans, about 10,000 miles long, that are just areas of vacuum. And spacecraft could theoretically linger there indefinitely without expending much fuel if calculations are correct, because both the Earth and the Moon's combined gravitational fields cancel each other out at those points. So using the Konrad Zuse computer systems, the mathematical models and computer simulations that the Reich had, they were able to show that basically through these points they could dominate the Earth. All 5 of these constitute strategic locations in space. This is what the war was about. L1 through L5. and known as Lagrange points or libration points. And the lowest energy transfer site for the 230-mile trips between Earth and Mars were basically at L1. They could be fitted with military facilities, and they were kind of like a motel, gas station, or warehouse, restaurant, garage that was set up there. L2 was an important clandestine assembly area because cislunar and Earth-based sentinels couldn't see it. L3, the other Lagrange point, was a semi-stable staging base for military operations directed against the Earth or spacecraft orbiting around it. And but all the decisive advantages were really with L4 and L5. And these were stable, totally stable libration points, which could dominate the Earth-Moon system because they looked down both gravity wells. There was no other location that was equally commanding in terms of that. You dominate those points and you dominate the Earth. And so the Third Reich was setting up an empire that would make them the legitimate government of planet Earth. And the American response was one of absolute desperation. They responded with Project Argus, or Operation Argus, as it was known militarily. They passed it off propagandistically as a project to the civilian public. But basically, starting on August 27th of 1958, they started the first of 3 nuclear bomb salvos to destroy the atmosphere. Do you comprehend what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. To destroy the atmosphere. Basically, what they did was on August 27th of 1958, they basically launched their first missile, and on August 30th and September 6th, they launched 2 more atomic missiles. And what they did was they irradiated space. They created 3 enormous artificial Van Allen radiation belts that stretched thousands of miles into the atmosphere. And they created havoc with military space systems. And in the vacuum of space, there's nothing to dissipate or absorb the radiation. So high energy electrons strike any object. They generate X-rays. The X-rays are penetrating. They damage electronic equipment. They erase computer memories. They're lethal to astronauts. And since the radiation belts were global and they extended thousands of miles up, all the orbiting satellites of that time were passing through regions of intensified radiation. So basically, near-Earth space, which was the region that military planners had to contend with in that day and age, were rendered an intrinsically vulnerable environment. You know, after the billions of Reichsmarks had been spent on space stations, space-based missile systems, aerospace plans, and other warfighting satellites, the entire array of military space equipment was rendered useless because of these nuclear warheads within the Earth's magnetic field being detonated. And basically, these regions of intense radiation in the upper atmosphere we're talking about, they covered the Earth. They initially were hundreds of miles wide. They were created basically in the South Polar region and carried by the magnetosphere, which centers on our magnetic poles all the way around the planet. And they wiped out radio communications and reflected warning and guidance radar, you know, all over the Atlantic continent. In other words, they couldn't communicate with their moon base. And the increased ionization of the upper atmosphere resulting from these nuclear explosions proved hazardous to high-altitude bombers, aerospace gliders. All the pilots who were above 50,000 feet were going through a region of intensified ionization, and they received lethal doses of radiation which killed them. And they were unable to reach their targets. So they rendered all of space militarily unworkable and created the phenomena of cancer worldwide, which never existed before. Until that point in history, combined with the above-ground testing done by the British, the French, the Soviets, the Americans at Yucca Flats, in the Pacific, everywhere else, this is what sank it. This is what made the phenomena of cancer a worldwide human phenomena. Statistically, every one of us will know someone who they love who will die of cancer because of this. So you have to ask yourself, was it worth it?
Now, I'm assuming that these radiations dissipated over time. Otherwise, you wouldn't have anybody going up there. up into space, even if it was in orbit.
Well, you have to remember, do you think that they care?
Well, people are back here. I mean, unless nobody went up and came back, and it's all that giant of an illusion.
No. People have gone up there and they've come back, and the astronauts passed through the Van Allen radiation belt fast enough where they're being afflicted by cancer is statistically just as normal as anyone else. So they're not made more sick than the rest of us. Maybe slightly more like somebody who travels in airplanes constantly and is exposed to ultraviolet radiation. Let's put it this way. Basically, anyone enters a realm naturally of radiant energy as soon as they leave Earth's protected atmosphere. Risks are at least in low Earth orbits, but they rise rapidly in the Van Allen belts.
Okay, well, let me just do this kind of a fast 1, 2, 3 thing for here. So, I was listening along the way, and so did the Nazis or Germans actually get to the moon?
They did, but that base is no longer extant. Basically, everyone there died from lack of resupply.
Okay, but there would be some kind of physical marker of it if it did. So they got to the moon, they landed, they didn't get resupplied, and they left. And so one might assume then that the USA did go to the moon as well.
Yes.
Right, because there is some decent evidence that at least the footage that we've been shown has been prepared on Earth. It doesn't mean they didn't go, but some of the looking at some of the video and seeing the effects that could have been used to do it, it does look like some of the films were perhaps faked. Not necessarily because they didn't go, but just in case the cameras didn't work or something, they wanted to have some footage. So that would be the minimal, and that they did go.
Well, all the while that the Americans went to the moon, they also conducted several artificial just moonshots in studios on Earth, just so they would have better propaganda footage, because the quality of film that was taken in the lunar environment was not necessarily very attractive or the best kind of quality imagery in the world. So they did studio shots just for the sake of propaganda, but they went to the moon. Their logic is since the going to the moon for them was an occult and propaganda exercise, there was nothing of military value that came out of it, then that makes perfect sense.
Right, okay. All right, so now, how come at this point, I mean, do you know why the Russians never landed on the moon, or did they?
Well, what the Russians and the Americans began to fight over was Krunia, which is Earth's second moon. And this is something that most people are totally unaware of, and people can look this up. It's spelled Cruithne. Cruithne. And it's named after an extinct Celtic tribe that was probably has remnants or vestiges genetically in Ulster in this day and age, and it was first landed on by an Irish-American astronaut. And we have to ask ourselves, why is this important? Well, because everywhere you look on the internet, they'll say, well, this is in an eccentric Earth moon orbit. It's in a horseshoe orbit. And
they're calling it an asteroid.
Right. Well, this is so preposterous, and I'll explain why. When you stand on Krunia, you can see, again, without telescopic aid, as an astronaut through a faceplate, both the Earth and the Moon in one view. In other words, both Earth and Moon are visible as a singular double planet system, a binary planet, in your faceplate. You can see it with the naked eye, so to speak, through that faceplate, without telescopic aid, both of them at once. That is what makes Krunia so strategically invaluable. Now, if you go to Phobos and Deimos on Mars, then people say, well, if you look at them, they're really just planetoids and asteroids just like this. I mean, if you take a look at the size and the diameter of Krunia, it's the exact same size as either Deimos or Phobos. I forget which one. One of them is bigger. The other one's pretty much the exact same size. Now, both of these little planetoids orbiting Mars are called moons. They dignify them with the name of moon when they're going around Mars. But if it's going around the Earth, they say, oh, it's not a moon. Well, this is a lot like the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes of North America are a sea zone in military terms because you can pump ships into them to basically militarily affect the futures and destinies of either Canada or the United States or Quebec. And the ships that are going to get pumped into the Great Seas region, you could pump in an enormous number of military ships. As a matter of fact, there are wrecks of ships, which are merchant ships, victims of squall and sabotage from the Second World War, that are bigger than the Titanic. You have shipwrecks at the bottom of the Great Lakes that are physically larger than the Titanic. And yet they say, oh, they're not a sea zone. Well, that's just crazy. In military maps, they're a sea zone. In civilian maps, they say they're lakes. Okay, it doesn't matter. If you
right, I'm looking at the, and I know things can be made to look however you would like them to be, but I'm looking at the plotting of the orbits. It would appear that it's orbiting around the sun. I'm trying to visualize this because this is going to be skewed for the purposes here of claiming it's not a moon.
Right.
And I'm trying to look at the motions and make my own. Okay, I can see. Yeah.
Well, you'll find that if you look at different charts of Krunia, you'll find that they have different orbits for it. You'll see it presented in different orbits. They have their purposes for skewing this. You'll see one orbital chart will look fairly different from another, depending on who's entered that orbital chart. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So my point is, the Americans and the Soviets were fighting essentially over Krunia. And that is where astronauts landed many times and fought and died. Now, because the National Socialists had...
What was the strategic advantage of Krunia then? It seems to go pretty far away from the Earth at times too.
Yes, that makes it even more of a strategic advantage. During such periods of time, you could assemble force projection instruments or elements, is the military term for it, force projection elements, such as commando units of astronauts, rockets or missiles to hit the Earth or the Moon, and when it gets back into orbit, you're ready to strike. Then it's taken away out of striking range out of range of retaliation. So
I don't know if this is wrong. I mean, it's claiming that the closest approach is 30 times farther than the Moon.
Yeah, but what does that matter? If you're launching a missile and you calculate it right, it's going to hit the Earth.
Well, wouldn't it be easier to shoot it from the Moon?
Yes, but with Krunia, you can assemble it without observation.
Oh, because it goes away.
Yes, without taking the time to assemble a whole infrastructure and logistical nightmare on the dark side of the Moon. That's the Nazis organized a base on the south pole of the Moon because of regions of water availability and also escape from the power of sunlight. The sun becomes so powerful, you can get third-degree burns in direct exposure to sunlight in space. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of effect that we're talking about. So in terms of Krunia, the Moon, the Lagrange points, the libration points, we're talking about various strategic battles for orbit originally taking place with the Third Reich, which eventually had to retreat under Antarctica into what is known as Unterland, within vast caverns, using geothermal energy with which to power the lighting system and maintain their lifestyle. Then, as for the Soviets, their program was so aggressive. Keep in mind that the cosmodromes in Kazakhstan and the former Soviet republics were the busiest cosmodromes on Earth. The Americans would call such places astrodomes, the space version of airports. The Americans reached the International Space Station, the International Space Station, through Russian rockets launching out of Kazakhstan to this day. The American space shuttle program is dead, civilian-wise. So all they've got is the remnants of the once proud Soviet space program. Now, we are all familiar with Mir, MYR, the scientific station that was orbiting the Earth for many years. Most people don't realize that there were 4, at least, military Mirs. They are known as Solyuts. People can look this up. Solyuts. S-O-L-Y-U-T. Solyuts with an S would be the plural. So a Solyut was an armored Mir, produced by the Energia, state-owned Soviet company in, of course, Eurasia, and launched, put into orbit around the Earth. the Soviets were on the verge of dominating space, and the Americans prevented it through Operation Odysseus, or the Odysseus program. Odysseus, named after the mythical figure in Hellenic mythology. And the Odysseus program used what was known as the Reserve Astronaut Corps. And the Reserve Astronaut Corps of the United States saw more launches, more action than any of the civilians in the American space program. And they saw actual space combat fighting the Soviets. So we're talking about a group of men sacrificing or putting their lives on the line using what we would consider today to be ridiculously obsolete technology, because the Germans dominated so much of the advanced technology. So instead of using these incredible field propulsion systems that the Germans were using to create their brief Reich in space before they retreated into an intraterrestrial existence, that's the term for it, as opposed to extraterrestrial, it's called intraterrestrial, before a subterranean existence that they acclimated to, basically, the Americans were stuck with World War II era rocket technology. And so were the Soviets. And so they were battling each other using this technology. Now, in space, you can't do all of these Star Wars maneuvers without massive advances in technology, because ships just do not go at that rapid a rate and make turns at that violent a rate in space. Basically, you have to work on planned orbital patterns in which to do combat with each other. And so what the Americans did was they created not just a military space shuttle, the Dinosaur that I spoke of, but a military spaceport in California. And
I was going to ask, how did they launch all these ships unnoticed?
Well, there was a secret cadre of about 32 astronauts based in Los Angeles. And they actually wrote about this on August 7th of 1989 in the New York Times. William Broad was the author, B-R-O-A-D, and he basically described a military Star Trek abortion, as he described it, that was run out of Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. And he basically said on August 7th of 1989, what is that, about how many years ago is that? That's got to be well over 20 years ago by now. He talked about the cancellation, supposedly, meaning that the budget just went black. They went off the books, of a $5 billion military space shuttle spaceport in California, Space Dome in Colorado, and the secret cadre of astronauts based out of Los Angeles. And this, he spoke about a Lockheed underground California airstrip that had hangar pylons underground, raised, and electromagnetic radiation beamed to test radar signatures out of these pylon-mounted objects. He was describing all this technical crap, which I can't even remember. I'm trying to dredge it out of the attic, which is my mind. The human mind is like a fishbowl that can only hold so many marbles. And once you put too many marbles in there, it cracks. So, you know, basically my fishbowl cracked and I lost all my marbles a long time ago. But I do know for a fact that Wright-Patterson in the 1960s, the United States Air Force, basically flew two so-called UFOs out of hangars at night that were spherical in nature. But basically, this was all based on technology that was given to them by over 100 Nazis that lived in Fort Bliss, West Texas, New Mexico. And what was the name of their White Sands Launch Complex? Launch Complex 33. Compare it to Factory 333 near Heliopolis outside of Cairo in Egypt. We're talking about hundreds of E-2s were launched from here. The Redstone Arsenal in northern Alabama was also based on this. But out of White Sands, the Launch Complex 33, you had white silver discs interacting with the rocket launchers on film. You know, basically going off to 45, 180 degrees, turning back. These are all just basically drones. But Peenemünde SS General Walter Dornberger brought the next generation booster, which was the space shuttle designed by Eugen Sanger in the 1930s, to the Bell Corporation in upstate New York. This is where they got the military space shuttle, the Dinosaur, flown by Neil Armstrong until 1962, who just recently died. I remember that before he passed away, George Noory of Coast to Coast AM had met his wife in a shopping mall, and she had basically said he was leaving her for a younger girl. And, all I could think of when he died was, those Viagra bottles say on the warning label not to use this product if you've got a heart condition. And
but I actually looked up this dinosaur before you even mentioned it at this time. And it's funny because you get conflicting things. One says never built, and then yet there's another one that's showing a picture of it with somebody walking by it. So.
Oh, well, there you have it. Yeah, that's in terms of
I take that back. It was a small picture. It was computer generated. So, but they're saying it was never built, and so it probably was built. It just never was released that it was built.
Well, it was built. I can assure you of that.
Yeah.
I can't believe that they're even saying it wasn't built. I mean, to me, that's preposterous. I mean, it's generally accepted in aerodynamic circles as a fact. So, to me, anyone saying it's not built would be like saying that helicopters were never built. I mean, if a civilian space shuttle was built, and all of the astronauts, until fairly recently in history, the majority of the space program was a military program. All of the astronauts were former military pilots. So you had to have military experience to be an astronaut.
Very interesting. It was a single pilot reusable plane, and it's kind of ingenious how it was attached on the top of a rocket. It looks pretty usable.
Yeah,
reasonable. And it's.
Yeah. Well, it was the workhorse of its day, and basically it was used to destroy the Soviet space program and prevent them from dominating the moon and Mars. With their aggressive program, they were very close to doing it. So their cosmonautical space capsules, much more primitive, much more brutal in their boost power, were basically wiped out by the reserve astronauts of the American program.
All right, let me stop here for a second. I'm going to take a little break here, but let me just summarize here. We're talking about the secret space program, and we're people tuning in maybe thinking you're going to hear about, like I said, the jump from the Mars, etc., the alien presence on the moon, etc. And what we're talking about here is a space program that was using technology that was period technology that was able to get into space and whatnot, and used to sabotage the Russian space project, so basically being a military type incident, all the while it's the rah-rah, zis boom bah, we're going to Mars with the astronauts. They were like the cover story, so to speak, in the press, while they were behind the scenes with this ship that never was built, that was going around having warfare, illegal. What's the word? Illegal doesn't matter anymore by now.
Yeah.
But legal warfare in the air, which is more conventional. But to me, it's also more damaging. I mean, it's more damning. Yeah. I mean, if you were to have a secret program that has a jump from to Mars, okay, that's bad because the technology could be used to help life on Earth. But if you're having a secret space program using conventional technology that is killing other astronauts, I mean, it's more damning. And of course, that is the center of a lot of the stuff you're talking about. Is the little dirty secrets hidden under the rug are very big and very nasty and very evil secrets.
Well, the audio that I had, which was ultimately, unfortunately, fell into the wrong hands, I played while I was on the air with Clyde Lewis, and people can look that up and basically hear the screams of the cosmonauts as they're dying. Because that audio was recorded on ham radios by Italian brothers who spent their entire life just collecting as much cosmonautical radio traffic as they could. You can hear the Soviet cosmonauts, some of them women, burning alive as they re-enter the atmosphere after their space planes and shuttles and capsules were destroyed by Americans in the Odysseus program.
Okay, let's hold on right there. One thing I want to say as I go is that will you be able to address a supposedly current, we're calling it a space police plane that is currently flying in the air. It is supposedly going, either it's robotic, I think it's computer controlled. It's supposed to be armed and dangerous to those up in space it doesn't want. And it looks like it might be an offshoot and a modernization of this design. I'm going to try and find it. If I can find a name for it, I can
tell you right now before the break. I can't address that. Obviously,
Okay.
I'm a documents destruction specialist who's working with.
But I didn't know if you in your travels said, okay. Well, let's hold on here. We'll just take a little break.
But I appreciate the question. You never know.
Right. I don't. I believe me, at this point, I assume nothing. So, all right. Well, hold on a second, and we'll be right back after a little break. Continue as we get into the meat of the whole point of today, which is the secret American, the United States space program.